Thank you, Nancy. On behalf of RENISON University College, I extend a warm welcome to today's Black History Month talk by Dr. Wilburn Hayden. However, before we start, and in keeping with RENISON's commitment to the truth and reconciliation calls to action, and to honor the lives of stolen and murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit people, and all Indigenous peoples, we'll begin today's event with a land acknowledgement. I encourage you in each of your communities to acknowledge and honor the territories, the stolen lands that you are now occupying. RENISON University College respectfully acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of the Arawandawang, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The University of Waterloo is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. In making this land acknowledgement, we'd like to express our gratitude for and solidarity with land defenders in our local area and across Turtle Island. RENISON University College is a unique space. Our original founders established the college's motto, the phrase, "One sky over all." This phrase has evolved over the years to encompass all that we do at RENISON. RENISON believes deeply in contributing to a world in which social justice, respect for diversity, and equity are not just aspirations, but they're realities. We believe that barriers exist where ignorance and misunderstanding prevails, and we aim to collapse those barriers through programs that improve our understanding of cultures and languages, social and economic environments, and questions related to race, gender, sexuality, spirituality, and a shared sense of belonging. And it's in this spirit that we offer today's talk on the omission and exclusion of Black people in Canada. So I'm going to now pass it over to Moyo, who is a lecturer at the School of Social Work, to introduce our esteemed speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Daly. Thank you, Nancy. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Hayden. Dr. Wilburn Hayden has been a university professor and social worker since 1973. He teaches and writes from critical race and anti-oppression perspectives. Growing up in the segregated Southern USA, he knows of the racial injustice struggle in the USA and Canada firsthand. His social work practice experiences include being the chief social worker in a state prison, organizing within disadvantaged communities, directing a human services agency, and involvement in political campaigns in North America. Without further ado, may we please welcome Dr. Hayden.
Good morning. I'm pleased to be here with you and share my findings from my research. Over the years, I have visited libraries, archives, special collections, and anywhere I can to find documents on Black Canadians. I've traveled between the Maritimes and Victoria. My thanks goes to Dr. Daly for inviting me, to Nancy Yee for doing all the work to make this possible, and to Maya Matuba, who had just introduced me. Also, I would like to thank you all, because one thing we've seen this Black History Month is there's a lot of places and opportunities for us to learn. And so by you being here, I'm appreciative. Thank you. The reality is that the overt acts, though very serious, is not so much the case in Canada. It was and continues to be more directly tied to oppression and attitudes and prejudice of Canadians and New Canadians, what we call microaggressions. It is the covert attitudes and prejudice that make race a factor today. My working definition of the Canadian ethos with respect to race projects Canada as a nation consisting of diverse races with traditions, cultures, and values rooted in whiteness. The ethos seeks to maintain the belief that the nation is white. Racialized residents are often cast as visitors, guests, the others, or invisible, regardless of Canadian birth or Canadian citizenship. Perhaps a classic event that demonstrates the ethos is the question, where are you from? White Canadians have repeatedly asked this question of me and other racialized residents. To the racialized person, it becomes a reminder that you do not belong, or at best questions your presence. Canada's ethos on race has evolved over time and has manifested itself differently depending on historical circumstances. The extent and degree in which the nation's national traditions, cultures, and values held within regions and local communities may differ. Therefore, attempting to identify and define the national traditions, cultures, and values is not absolute. Rigidly defining Canadian ethos is equally impossible, but racism and white supremacy are elements found within regions and communities. I draw on examples of historical records, national policy, public actions, and publications that profess to provide a Canadian history. I'm going to just now talk a little about publications that illustrate this history. Books and publications about Canada are knowledge-producing tools that capture how the nation presents itself, thus shaping Canadian readers' understanding of themselves within the ethos. Thus, texts and publications are one way of examining the exclusion and omission of Blacks and other racialized groups. The intersection of the Canadian author's perspective and the reader's consumption is where the national traditions, cultures, and values confirm the ethos. Thus, by examining publications about Canada, one can identify elements of the ethos. The elements illustrate how racialized groups have been marginalized and left out of the nation's identity. I looked at 11 publications about Canada between 1960 and 2007. 2 books by Tate were required texts in Ontario schools throughout the 70s, thus fostering the racial element of the ethos for generations of Ontario students. The books were selected based on titles and desire to select a range of books from picture books to short histories. Table 1 reveals that many Canadians, insert please. Yep. Table 1 reveals that many, and you probably can't read it, so just stay with me, reveals that many Canadians will not be exposed to a history that included Blacks. The absence supports the ethos of locating Blacks outside of the Canadian mainstream and the story of Canada. The few citations and pages about Black people are examples of exclusion. I know, again, just bear with me. I'm not gonna go through this whole table, but I'm gonna cite a couple of them. What the first one is George Tate. This book was produced in 1960 and was required for elementary students in Ontario. It said, on the question of Blacks, slaves were cited 1 time. The number of pages in which Blacks were discussed were 4. 455 pages was the total amount of pages. And then came in 1973, he had published The One Dominion under the name of Canada. And this was required for Ontario secondary schools. In that, Negroes was noted, but the number of pages only were 3 out of 439. The interesting part of his book was that when I first looked at it, I started by looking in the index for Black, and there was nothing there. So I went to colored, and there was nothing there. So then I went to Negroes, and in there it says, see slavery. So I slide to the S's, and they forgot to include the citation. This is an example of what I mean by omission and neglect. I'm not going to go any further on the table. The exclusion and omission of Black Canadians is startlingly clear in review of these 11 publications. It shows that the ethos has nearly erased Black Canadians. These publications that inform generations of Canadians on their history provide a limited and selected discussion of Black Canadians. In the few appearances, Black people are foreign, existing outside of Canada, usually from the US. Focusing on specifically Black Canadians is rare. And the discussion on Canadian racism and white supremacy almost non-existent. We are now seeing more publication by and about Black people, but the majority of whites are not reading those works. Jennifer Harris speaks to the exclusion and omission of Blacks in historical publication on New Brunswick and historical publication on New Brunswick. She cited 3 authors who left Black people out of the local histories. Quote, nonetheless, despite the historical presence, Black residents have been excluded from many local histories. It is perhaps not surprising that John Reed's History of Mount Alice University, founded in 1839, participated in its omissions in his work published in 1984. More curious, I'm still quoting, more curiously is the fact that seminal works of Sackville by James Dean Snowden, published in 1974, and William B. Hamilton, published in 2004, make no mention of free or Black enslaved Black residents or population in Sackville or Westmoreland generally, end quote. For the remaining part, I'm going to talk about slavery in Canada. Exclusion and omission have embedded racial non-truths in the Canadian ethos. The most integral and detrimental non-truth is the belief that Canada never had or had limited involvement in slavery and the transatlantic Black slave trade. Denying Canada's part in slavery serves the ethos twofold. It constructs Canada as a benevolent country free from consequences of the cruelty of slavery. Secondly, if Canada never opposed its Black population, never oppressed its Black population, then it does not need to address the racist system that formed and benefited from slavery, or the legacies of these systems today. An example of Canadian Black history within the Canadian ethos is the historical records of Canada's participation in the Atlantic Black slave trade. The enslavement of people of African descent was as much part of Canadian history as the acknowledgement of Canada's role within the Underground Railroad. Slavery within the larger context of colonized Western Hemisphere was evident throughout all the colonies that created nations of the 21st century. This table shows 42 Western Hemisphere nations date for abolishing slavery. I originally started this piece of research to try to uncover when slavery started in these countries, but that was impossible. So I then said, well, let me look at when it was abolished, and going with the notion, you don't abolish something if you didn't have it. All the nations enslaved Blacks early in their colonial history. Thus, how can one conclude that slavery was not a part of Canada's history? Canada was no, let's speak a little to this table. You can't receive, but each one of these other different countries, and I have then the date in which slavery ended. And that's all the countries in the Western Hemisphere. Canada was no different from other colonies. As the table indicates, Canada maintained slavery until August 1st, 1834, when the British Empire abolished this practice of all other colonies within its empire. The act passed Parliament on August 28, 1833, and took effect August 1st, 1834. Whereas the act ended slavery, but to appease slave owners, its original created a 6-year apprenticeship that forced nearly free Blacks to work under their former masters. However, while no longer called slavery, Blacks were still not free under the original passed act. Only at the conclusion of the 6-year forced apprenticeship in 1840 would most slaves truly be emancipated. The original act included a provision that allowed the enslavement of children 6 years old or younger born of slave parents to remain enslaved until the age of 21 years old. Thus, slavery within Canada and the British Empire could have remained, at least by the original law, until 1855, when the last child born before August 1st, 1834, reached 21. Children born during the apprenticeship would become apprentice laborers with their mothers until the age of 12 years old. Resulting from pressure by English abolitionists and freed Blacks, all enslaved people across the British Empire finally gained their freedom at midnight, 31 July 1838, with the ending of the apprenticeship system. The next two slides are examples of early documents. Black slavery in Canada, as practiced by Europeans, may have begun as early as 1628 with a young boy from Madagascar who was enslaved and brought to New France, Quebec. The institution of slavery would continue to fuel the young colonies that would become Canada. One historian summarized Black Canadian slavery as an economy propelled by the fur trade as well as urban economics in some places. Enslaved Africans worked as rat catchers, hangmen, domestic servants. They were miners, housekeepers, fishermen, blacksmiths, cooks, and carpenters, and worked in hotels and bars wherever else the burgeoning cities needed unpaid labor. Legally owned by the church, lawyers, business people, and merchants, they suffer indignities, loss of control over their lives, and a dimming view of their own and their family's future that we can only imagine. Slaves labor endured on lands we now call Canada. Let's look at the presence of Black slavery within the 6 provinces that actually became a part of Canada: Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Quebec, and Ontario. So I'm going to just highlight just one or two points that just says that slavery was in those provinces during this time period. Until the British Colonies Act of 1833, abolished slavery, until the act abolished slavery in the British Empire, slavery was a lucrative practice that helped build Canada. The Canadian Council of Slavery, through the ethos lens, has largely been excluded and omitted from the mainstream. So let me just touch on Newfoundland. Slaves were servants or farm workers. The number of slaves were not large. Wills, the documents, proved to be the sources that provide evidence of slavery, according to Natasha Henry. And this is a quote: "The wills of some slave owners in the Maritimes freed their slaves when the owner died. Upon his death in 1791, Magistrate John Binger freed a man, woman, and 3 children. Similarly, in 1814, when John Ryan, founder of the Royal Gazette and the Newfoundland Advertiser, passed away, he emancipated his slave, Diana. Her two children were freed when they reached the age of 21. A second will is that a will of Richard Reed in 1831. And this will came into being just a few years before the official ending of slavery. The will confirms the ownership of a black slave. And this is a quote: "And I do charge all my estate, real and personal, with the payment thereof, except my Negro man slave named Lewis, herein after by me devised to my relation Edward Bryce Terrell. I give and devise unto my said relation Edward Bruce Terrell and his heirs my said Negro man slave named Lewis." And this is from the will of Richard Reed in Newfoundland, probated in 1831. Now jumping to Nova Scotia. Black slaves were part of the settlement and development of early Nova Scotia. They were servants, laborers, and supported the fishing industry. Slavery was an accepted part of 18th century life in the colonies. Most slaves worked as domestic servants. And this is a quote. Most Black people brought to Nova Scotia between 1749 and 1782 were slaves of English or American settlers. In 1750, a Royal Navy officer, Thomas Bloss, brought 16 slaves to Halifax, perhaps in order to crew vessels involved in maritime commerce. Prominent ship owners and trader Joshua Mugger sold slaves at auction in Halifax, and the newspaper advertisement for the return of runaway slaves were common. Included in the nearly 3,000 inhabitants of Halifax in 1750 were about 400 enslaved, 17 free Black people, end quote. The advertisement of slaves in the newspaper indicates that slavery was an element of Halifax commerce and labor supply. The ads were announcements for the sale and runaway of slaves and common in local papers. An example of one of the ads appeared in the Halifax Gazette in 1752. The ad announces the sale of recently imported slaves, woman, age 35, 2 boys, age 12 and 13, 2 male teenagers, age 18, and a man, age 30, from the West Indies by merchant Joshua Mugger. When the ethos portrays slavery, it was mild and benign, without the cruel or dehumanizing characteristics that were associated with slavery in the US, the Caribbean, and other regions within the Western Hemisphere. The ads of runaway slaves are indicators that conditions of slavery were such that slaves would take leave. An example found in Nova Scotia Gazette Weekly Chronicle, November 29, 1783, sought the return of a Black slave. And this is a quote. Runaway, a Negro man named Dick, belonging to Mr. Benjamin Douglas, about 5 feet 8 inches, stout, made. Whoever will apprehend said Negro and bring him to Mr. Thomas of Halifax merchants shall be handsomely rewarded. November 19, 1783. As cited in the table, cited in Table 1, slavery in the U.S. states adjacent to Canada abolished slavery for Canada. Thus, from 1700s to the late 1700s to 1834, slaves would escape Canada to the free states in the U.S. New Brunswick. Going back to Harris's article, Harris gives an in-depth account of the history of Black residents dating back to the 19th century in Sackville, Westmoreland, New Brunswick. The following discussion, which included points made by Cahill, speaks to the existence of Black slavery in New Brunswick. And this is quote, beyond the complications posed in attempting to characterize a population about which little personal information was recorded, it is additionally difficult to quantify the number of Black people transported to the region as chattel. As Cahill points out, there are no statistics earlier than the summer of 1784, when according to the military census, slaves accounted for a mere 2.5% or 21 of the relative small largest refugees population of Cumberland County. This does not account for those individuals or families brought earlier by planters or purchased by Yorkshire settlers. Certain anecdotal evidence of 18th century Black men and women in this context have been preserved in various sources. What this suggests is that slaveholding was a fact of life in the region before the arrival of the Loyalists, end quote. Thus, as in other provinces, the enslavement of Black people occurred in New Brunswick. Prince Edward Island. On Prince Edward Island, formerly the island of St. John, the enslavement of Black people was reaffirmed through a legislative act. On March 1st, 1781, Prince Edward Island's Governor Walter Patterson dispatched to Lord Stormont, Earl of Mansfield, a recently passed legislative act that, according to William Riddle, the historian, the dispatch cited, quote, fixed the status of slavery upon all Negro and mulatto servants then on the island, or thereafter to be imported, being slaves, and provided they should continue to be slaves until freed by owner. Computer's frozen here. This is a quote. This legislation was introduced to protect the personal property of existing and future settlers. There were three main provisions. Baptism did not change slave status. Person enslaved in Prince Edward Island and remained so less free by their owners. Children born to enslaved women were born enslaved. To encourage white settlers to relocate to the island, an act of parliament was instituted in 1791, offering 40 shillings for every Negro brought by such white person. End quote. Both Riddle and Henry noted that the act made it clear that slavery was part of the origins of the island. Before returning to Quebec and Ontario, let's look at the Maritimes' role in transporting Black slaves to North America. This may be a place in which you may want to stand or to take a 20-second break. I think it's about halfway point. But don't go away. I'm now going to present one of the major findings of my research. Black Atlantic slave trade. How many of you have eaten salt cod in the Caribbean islands? How many of you are of Caribbean heritage and have eaten salt cod? Cod does not live in the waters of the Caribbean. Cod lives in the North Atlantic. A non-commercial cod lives in the North Pacific. So hold that thought. Peter Pope, 2004 book, provides evidence of slavery often omitted or excluded in historical records of Newfoundland and the Maritimes. Apologetically, he established that Newfoundland planters were associated with slave merchants from Barbados. And this was one of the first clues to say for me to begin to look at this connection. Visiting slavers, and this is the quote as you see on the screen, visiting slavers occasionally sold men in the 17th century in Newfoundland, but slave ownership was not common. The St. John's Thomas Oxford complained to the theft of his covenant Negro servant, and it suggested that a few Africans worked as servants on the English shore, and that there were those who were quite prepared to enslave them. Again, very apologetic. The Maritimes' role in feeding and transporting the sale of Black bodies was important to the commerce in the region. The records of ships porting in the Maritimes during 17th and 19th century shed light on Black human cargo. Ships transporting salt cod ported in Newfoundland and within all the maritime harbors provide the major source of protein food for slaves in southern USA, the Caribbean, and South America. The ships did not return to the Maritimes empty. Along with rum, agricultural products and animals, sugar and related byproducts, and other trade goods, Black bodies were included in the cargo bays. The vast majority of human beings as cargo were shipped south to slavery in the US. Our hands are not clean. The following table links the Maritimes to the African slave trade. A review of ship passengers and general cargo lists supports the historical record of St. John's and the Maritimes in 17th century and 19th centuries as slave trading ports. Again, you won't be able to see these, but what I've done is these records were in the Memorial University and Newfoundland Maritime Historical Archives located on the campus. There's a whole series of microfilms. I took as many as I could in the time I had left to be there, and just went through to look at the cargo listing. And so I'm not going to do all of these, but the very first one, which was dated, the ship's log dated May 27, 1749, it lists 90 slaves, and it came from Bermuda. And then then it's the second one, which you really can't read, but I'll read it to you. April 1, 1764, the cargo entry lists 20 Negroes, because each entry was for a different owner, so they weren't all bunched in together. So each sighting it had a name attached to who owned the cargo. So it listed their first 20 Negroes, then another person owned 20 more Negroes, 52 Negroes, 5 new Negroes, and 33 Negroes. I gather, I hadn't been to chase this down, but I gather that when you say new Negroes, that meant that the slave came directly from Africa to the Caribbean and then shipped up to Canada, whereas the Negroes could be ones that were traded for South America and other Caribbean countries. So I'm not gonna, again, let me just do one more, which is March 25th, 1776, 45 Negroes and 20 Negroes. So the records that are showing, these ones that were at the Maritime Center, clearly shows Canada's role in shipping Blacks to North America. Whereas maritime residents may not have owned large numbers of slaves, enslavement of Black people did occur. Perhaps more significantly, slave trade was an important form of commerce. These tables list enslaved Black people as cargoed from ships porting in St. John's Harbor. Ships transporting salt cod ported in all the maritime harbors returned with Black slaves. At the end of my talk, if time permits, I will show you some of the actual log entries from the 3 ships, from 3 of the ships. The historical record supports that Canada engaged in slavery and the transatlantic Black slave trade. Unfortunately, Canadian history has mostly deliberately excluded that past, adding to the nearly omitting of Black Canadians from the nation's mainstream. Now, going back to the provinces, Quebec. When the British took over Canada in 1760, there were 6,604 slaves in New France. Most of them were Panties, representing the First Nation. The rest were Blacks. Quoting from the province Quebec, the British governor of Quebec in 1763 left no doubt that slavery was to be maintained. And this is a quote. British Governor James Murray made it clear that the Canadians would be permitted to retain their slaves. He even hoped to bring more. Thus, he asked a friend from New York in 1763 to help him bring to Canada, quote, 2 stout young fellows, end quote, and so that they won't be lonely, quote again, for each a clean young wife, end quote. Still quoting from the text. Reading the papers of the late 18th century, we can see that they contain many advertisements for slaves for sale for about 50 pounds each. We can find rewards for capturing runaways, and this is in Quebec. The majority of slave owners, however, were French Canadians. More than 85% of the census of those during that time. Some notable Anglophones, such as Chief Justice William Smith, Henry Cottle, or George Alsall, owned several slaves. There was another difference. The French preferred Panties, or the First Nation slave, who were cheaper, while the British owned Black slaves, who were considered stronger, lived longer, and mostly skilled, end quote. As it was with the British Empire, slavery was a hallmark of early French Canada. Now to Ontario. Though slavery in Ontario existed before the formation of Ontario's government, it was evident at the first Parliament that slavery would remain within the province and would be maintained. And this is a quote. The first Parliament of province of Upper Canada sat in Newark, formerly and now Niagara-the-Lake, September 17, 1792. The very first act of this Parliament of Upper Canada restored the English civil law. This did not destroy slavery, nor did it ameliorate the condition of the slave. It was rather the reverse. For as the English law did not recognize the status of slave, when it was forced by grim facts to acknowledge slavery, it had no room for the slave except as mere piece of property. Instead of giving him human rights, lives, those of service, he was deprived of all rights, marital, parental, property, and even the right to live. In the English law and system found on it, the slave had no rights which the master was bound to respect, end quote. Similar to other provinces, slavery was legally established and protected by law in Ontario. The laws firmly subjected Black people to slavery. The laws existed and were so openly established through legislation, one begins to wonder why slavery is not included in the Canadian mainstream. The extent to which the Canadian ethos influenced the exclusion and omission can be deemed as one of the reasons. So in summary, at the foundation of modern racism and white supremacy in Canada is the enslavement of African people. The fear, hatred, and exclusion that Black people experience today is the product of a system that needed to define a group of people as less than human in order to justify their enslavement. To understand why Black people are marginalized today, one must understand the implications of the history of slavery. Black Canadians, whether it be Caribbean, African, Americans, or who have been Canadians for generations, experience systemic racism much like African Americans in the US. I question the ethos that implies that slavery did not exist or was limited in Canada or strictly an American institution. The ethos which supports the degree to which the exclusion and omission of Canada's history of slavery serves to construct Canada as a place where racial justice, inequality, and discrimination were at most limited and outside of the Canadian mainstream is simply a myth. The historical record supports that Canada engaged in slavery and the transatlantic Black slave trade. Unfortunately, Canadian history has mostly deliberately excluded that past. This begs the question, how strong and progressive can a nation be if it does not know or attempts to erase its own historical oppression? How strong? As much as the ethos excludes and omits racism from Canada's mainstream, Black Canadians still encounter systemic and personal racism that limit their opportunities and quality of life. For example, police carding of Black youth. The recorded history of oppressing Black people in Canada is a key element for challenging the Canadian ethos. It is not a matter of understanding Black history, but understanding Canada's history of Black Canadians. Only when these records and their present-day consequence are known and accepted by the mainstream can Canada become truly an inclusive society. The interplay of the recorded history and contemporary denials is a key element for challenging the Canadian ethos. The ethos creates barriers that prevent Black and white Canadians from recognizing the need for change. Questioning the ethos requires us to challenge the past for a just future in a fear-free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Thank you for being here on Zoom. I don't know if we want to go to the actually slips logs. I don't know if we really want questions first, or how do you want to proceed from here?
Well, thank you, Dr. Hayden. I would love if we can go to questions.
Okay.
Yeah. Nancy, may you help us explain how the Q&A works in this webinar format?
Hi, so what we're going to do is invite any of our attendees to ask any questions. There is a Q&A section that's just down at the bottom of your screen. So if you click on that, you can ask a question. We'll give you, you know, a couple minutes or so to add some questions, and Dr. Hayden will be able to answer those for you.
Thanks a lot, Nancy. Thanks a lot, Dr. Hayden. I learned so much. That was a very rich, deep, detailed presentation. I have a lot of questions, but you know, you and I will have our own time to chat. I hope. I hope. So in the meantime, we have a question. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna read the questions as they come in. The first question is from Dory. It says, "Are there any current textbooks that tell the truth about the history of Blacks in Canada that are used in our schools?"
Yes, there are a number of ones coming out in the last 5 years. Maynard's book, The Policing of Black People, it's perhaps pretty comprehensive. But there are things. There have been books in the past, but not so many. But now there seems to be a number of Black scholars able to get published in Canada to tell the story of Black people, or tell the whole story of Canada. So there are some. I have a bibliography someplace, but I don't know how to get it to all the people.
Cool. Well, maybe you can just send the bibliography to myself or Dr. Daly, and we'll distribute it around.
Okay, I will do that.
Yeah, that would be very helpful. Thank you, Dr. Hayden. We have another question. Are you seeing any changes in Canadian textbooks arising from research like yours?
Well, because I really like staying in the past, the history. So I haven't really, other than books I'm reading by contemporary Black authors that include history, I really can't say what is out there, because it's just not, and I'm not focusing on contemporary accounts of history. I know a couple of publishers who have talked about working with school boards and including more text and turning out more text. The question is, you can produce them, but will the school boards adopt them? I know some provinces are having difficult adopting texts that try to tell the truth.
Thank you. We have another question. How can we make the information such as slave trade documents? How can we make the information and documents around the slave trade? I'm just gonna reread the question in this way. How can we make it accessible to the public?
Well, I mean, obviously the gatekeepers who control publications, you know, journals and books are one of the sources that we got to reach in trying to get the whole story out. There are a number of scholars that are trying to get it out. I have my blog, and it's more like a commercial, I guess, wilburnhayden.com, and I'm putting up content from my research. I'm a long ways from getting it completed, so it's in process. But I think as particularly coming out of the summer and the whole focus on Black concerns in Canada, I would hope, and I think we're going to find more opportunities to really hear that story, or at least connect that story to the total picture of Canada. Yeah, so I think it's slowly coming out there, but again, when I think of school boards making decisions, oftentimes they make the decision from a white supremacist standpoint and minimize the need to include Black content.
Thank you for that. Another question, in relation to the books that have limited content about Black people in our history, has there been a large increase of content with Black people? I think this is a similar question. But however, the person has another question, which says, is there a difference between public and private schools with this issue?
I have no experience to make that comparison. My son went to public school. That's why I can't make that comparison.
This is another good question from Nyaga, who I actually happen to know. A great and rich presentation. You have provided us with immense material and symbolic histories on Black and Blackness. This is such a lot of research and review of Black literatures. What is your take on race-based data?
I think it's essential. I think historically, even the Black community in Canada was reluctant because they got caught up in this white supremacist notion that if you have the numbers out there, then it's going to show that we got a problem. So there's been historically, there's been a real attempt not to do any collection of data under that notion. But to me, that's a smokescreen. It's about maintaining white supremacy. But I think as we see from coming out of the summer, police departments, different places are now, collecting that data. But it's still difficult. For instance, in Hamilton, Ontario, there are now 2 Black firefighters out of, I think, 430. In the past month, I've tried to get the data to find out what it is in Toronto, because I suspect our firefighters, we've been doing a lot of work about police, but we need to look at our firefighters. And I'm beginning to wonder, as I talk to individual informally about it, that our firefighters throughout Canada is a white supremacist organization.
I'm just going to follow up with another question related to the data piece. So there have been other people who are using the argument that, sometimes when we talk about race-based data, it might require re-traumatizing people to access that data. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's absolutely true. But what about the future people who are trying to survive in Canada? So I wish we could do both. But what I can say is that in absence of it, particularly in the early years when I was doing my research, I kept running against white folks telling me, where's the evidence? What is the data? And without having that data, I could say, I don't have it. Then they say, let's move on. So it's a tricky balance. Traumatization is very real. And I respect, people who have to go through those stories. But at the same time, how do we push change if we don't have the documentation based on the white supremacist structure that requires us to have hard data, as opposed to listening to the narratives of people? We can, as Black folks, we can tell those stories all the time. We knew a long time ago, many decades ago, that police officers were treating us differently than white people, but we had no evidence to see it. And so for decades, it got ignored. And now that we're getting the data, people again say, oh yeah, that is a problem. But we knew it, Black folks knew it all the time.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hayden. We have another question. I remember when I was in elementary school, we talked about Black slavery in the context of the US. When it comes to Canada, there seems to be this desire to paint Canada as the moral heroes who had the Underground Railroad, which saved endangered Black folks from slavery. Why do you think Canada as a nation does this? What do we have to gain from erasing Black history in so-called Canada?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, it is about this ethos. They want to portray Canada as a white country. That's strictly a racist, white supremacist understanding. Even though we know Black people are here, but if we can erase that past and keep it out of, then we can keep this projection. And then it adds to, as I said earlier, it adds to our image, the feel that we have no race problem in Canada. So there's a lot of reason to maintain it, but a lot of it comes back to the fact that Canada enjoys being seen as a white country. Not everybody, but I think it is part of the ethos that, yes, this is a place. If you get outside our larger cities and you get into smaller communities in town, you can see it. I can see it when I walk down the street. I've had nails put in my tires when I go outside of Toronto. Even in Toronto, I have nails put in my tires sitting on my front street. So, what can you say?
Thank you, Dr. Hayden. So as a social worker, what are some of the ways we can begin to acknowledge history in current practice?
Well, I think first of all, I as a pensioner, retired person, I still teach a course at York University for as a required course for the 2-year program, which I do a Canadian history course, and it includes that. So I think as a social worker, we have to get in touch with our wrongs. We have to, as social workers, we've been part of victimization, racism, white supremacy, all this stuff throughout the years in Canada. So the first thing I would say, and I can go on for that for a lot longer, but as that our curriculums in social work, particularly our historical courses, have to really talk about Canadian social workers as not just the savers, but also the predators, and our participation in maintaining racism and white supremacy. I think that's the first step we got. And once we come to terms with that, and that's the truth of the large society, once we become conscious of that is part of what we're about for historically, then we can begin to open up to figure out ways, how do we prevent it, but also how do we move forward in a society that doesn't have to oppress Black people or any other groups.
Thanks, Dr. Hayden. So, Alexandra is curious. You mentioned that Black scholars are getting published, which is great. What sort of challenges did you face when it came to getting your work published?
I've been rejected so many times. I've been, I mean, and it's a difficult thing because I can shake my head and say it's it's racism, white supremacy, and people say that to block it. But it's like, I'll give you an example. I was at a meeting once, and a white scholar, made the point that, and the scholars in social sciences, wasn't in social work, made the point that identity field is old-fashioned, out of date. Okay, so most of us who are working on race, women, gender issues, identity is part of the basis of our research. Critical race theory is heavily in identity. So let's say I send a paper up to be reviewed, and this particular scholar reviews it. Before he or she reads my paper, when I talk about identity, it's already unacceptable. So it's things like that. I mean, it's not, the difficulties I've had has been people who I perceive, because I don't know who they are in blind reviews, that what I'm talking about is either out of the mainstream or not worthy to be print, and therefore you don't get published. I mean, I have no answers. I used to ask some of the white folks and Black folks as well, who are on the editorial boards, and talk about having them to be accountable to why so few articles and books have been coming out of the academic community. I have no answer.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is interesting. I just had an article rejected recently. And one of the comments by the editor was something to the effect that you are painting a picture of coloniality as all negative. I was talking in the context of education in Zimbabwe. And they said, what about the benefits of colonization around education, right? And of course, suggesting that European education is better, and it means that it's therefore beneficial to Zimbabweans. So yeah, it's just like, it's really interesting, and I can relate to also when I was doing my PhD and trying to figure out a topic, I completely changed, because I was like, I'm not getting checks, I'm not getting any funding, because the topic was too, it was too, it was too race-based, so to speak.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Black people can't talk about race.
Yeah. So I totally feel that question and wonder what needs to change, to have a more broad, a more inclusive scholarship space.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the point of our paper is people have got to go beyond the ethos and recognize that Black folks and other groups, I mean, I'm focusing strictly on Blacks, but I'm not at all downplaying any other population in Canada that's oppressed. But people got to understand that history in order to open themselves up to other ways of looking. And that, I mean, obviously a lot more to be done, but that's why I work in historical records, trying to get that information out there in hopes, because I can't make it happen, that enough people will look at it and began to say, wow, I need to change. I need to change my perspective. And then began to work, Black and white folks working together to try to build a stronger Canada, one that is inclusive, one that does build stronger ties in race and addressing it.
Thank you. Thank you. There's another question around data, and this is specific to whether you have any more data on Black enslavement in Ontario. Is your research mostly focused on the eastern provinces?
Oh no! Well, first of all, you got to first understand that slavery ended in 1834. So after 1834, you know, the other province that came online, there was no slavery because they weren't even existing in terms of European standard. Obviously, they were existing because indigenous people had the land. So you really have to stop on that. My work covers all of Canada. I've been in British Columbia. I've been in Victoria. I've been all digging up materials and documents. If you go to my website, and there's under the opening page is a section that talks about research and other documents. I have a whole section on slavery, if someone's interested in looking at that. And again, it's not complete. I'm still adding stuff. So there's under the research and publications. If you go to that, you'll see one folder that has slavery. And I think I can't count how many articles in there, but more and more being added every day. So if anybody wanted to at least see how I'm seeing framing slavery, that'll be the place to go.
Thank you, Dr. Hayden. James says, I heard that here in the Waterloo region, in the village of Hawksville, a community of Black people lived and died. Apparently, a cemetery remains. Are you aware of this community and what happened to this community?
Yeah, there were, I want to say hundreds, but I probably are off there, but there are numbers of Black communities scattered in Ontario between 1800s and 1865. Many of them were slaves who escaped from the U.S. and they were scattered all around. In fact, if you look on it, and there's a whole list of them, you can see like a crescent coming out of Niagara Falls, going all the way out, almost the outskirts in Toronto, Guelph, Ontario, and a lot of Underground Railroad. But before the Underground Railroad, all the way to Perry Sound of Black settlements. There's a couple of books that are written, and again, I didn't compare to talk about them, that really have narratives of people, of former slaves who are now living in Ontario. And this is like 1830, 1820. And it really, so I can't recall the specific one, but I'm aware of, and I probably have that in my notes, of the numbers of communities of Blacks who settled in Ontario between, I guess, probably 1800 to 1865. And then the war came, and this is the other thing that Canadians don't, when they talk about the Underground Railroad, they're pretty silent on the fact that 95% of the Blacks who escaped on the Underground Railroad from the U.S. went back to the U.S. So, I mean, it wasn't because, as out the Western province, it wasn't because of the weather. It was because of how the racial treatment that they received in Canada. And the record is clear in Ontario and alike that after the slavery, and that Blacks were still treated less than as human beings in this country, in this province, in other provinces beyond slavery, especially out west. The record out west, and that's part of my research as well, is where it's not focused on slavery, but it is about treating Black people as less than human beings. I mean, the Western province were one that in 1911 got the cabinet to do a cabinet order to ban Black people from coming to Canada. And it was rescinded, but it still was passed by the cabinet. So, I mean, our country is record is just not a very good record as how we like to portray it to be. Across the country, across from the Maritimes to Victoria, we have not been upfront in our relationship and talking about our relationship with Black people in this country.
We have a social work education question. As social work education is changing to become more social justice aware, what do you think are the current and/or future challenges for social workers in truly making changes to institutional racism?
Well, first of all, we have the person. I'm not sure what school the person is, but York University, and it's maybe a plug for York. This has been our role and what we do from the very beginning. And so when you say we're just now doing it, I have to argue, because York has been raising those issues from a critical race perspective for at least 2 decades. So I would think that if you're in a curriculum that's not doing that, you gotta question it. I mean, I was in undergraduate school in the late 60s, and that's in a time of student rights. And we issues like that are ones that we took on within our curriculum. And so that's something I can say. If you're not there, then you need to hold people accountable. I mean, faculty need to be accountable in terms of race in Canada.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hayden. We have a question around, some people kind of make a distinction between, continental African blackness and Caribbean blackness. And, sometimes there is kind of like tensions around that. Do you have any comment
I think
that specifically?
The thing that I think we often get lost in that type of discussion is that when I talk about race, I'm talking about people of African descent, the diaspora. When I start talking about African and Caribbean, that's ethnicity for me. And those are very important differences that we sometimes blend together. And I say that in the sense that if you were from Nigeria and you came to Canada, white folks are going to see you as black until you say something like that. So for me, yes, the ethnicity is important and we need to maintain our ethnicity. But I think, as in the case of all of us, we have multiple identities. And so, like, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a scholar, I'm a like to deal with that. And my point is that I don't need to be debating with people about which is better or not. All I'm saying is that include in your ethnicity an identity of blackness if you're in the Western Hemisphere. And you may go further, but I'm only speaking in terms of the Western Hemisphere. So I don't really want to, debate it. I'm just saying that the Black identity, regardless of where you're from, is very real. And you don't have to give up your ethnicity, but you need to pull together under the notion that what's happening here in the Western Hemisphere is because of your Blackness. Mm-hmm. And begin to form ways to not reject the ethnicity, but to build ways to bring about change around your Blackness.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that is very clear, Dr. Hayden. Appreciate that. We have another question from Nancy. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation, Dr. Hayden. When I went to school, there was a lot of talk about Canada as a safe haven for enslaved Africans because of the Underground Railroad. And we didn't talk about slavery in Canada at all. Now I can see the effects, as many seem to have this idea that racism doesn't exist in Canada, though it clearly does. Do you think it is possible to reframe this for people who already have these ideas based on the omission of historical records?
Well, I mean, that's why I'm doing the work I'm doing, is to try to help that. I'm one person, and there are other scholars. I mean, it's the Association of Black Scholars who are trying to. So I think, I still have to go back to the point I made, is that though we're seeing increases in terms of publications and books and stuff on Black people in Canada, but most white people will not read the book. So that's the first way you got to begin to say, question the ethos, is that you gotta pick up something that says what you were told was not true. I don't think that's happening. I mean, I know it's not happening in a larger way in our schools, and we gotta build a critical mass in Canada of people willing to say, let's tell the whole truth. And that then will start with our schools, elementary, primary, and secondary, but then start with other educational programs and try to get the word out. I think there's a lot of negatives about how stuff get put online, but that may be one of the ways we're going to have to do it. I know that's why I'm doing my website, is because I can't get past the gatekeepers. So I think we're going to have to really begin to go beyond the gatekeepers and begin to put out on the internet. And it's a lot of ill stuff out there, but it's going to take a lot of efforts, a lot of people. It's going to take first of all white people talking to white people about racism, more so than me yelling at white people about it. It's begin to get other people coming around. They can take what I'm talking about, what other people are saying about race, and begin to challenge each other about the lack of slavery information and our role in Canada slavery. But it's not an easy road. I don't know. I mean, I know it won't happen in my lifetime. Hopefully, in my son's lifetime. But I think we got to keep going. That's where I am. We got to keep pushing. I can sit back and say, forget about Canada, forget about the U.S., forget about the world. But that wouldn't be where to go. The way is to keep talking, and that's what I'm trying to do. Keep talking, keep raising it, and hope we get some fertile ground, and we can begin to build what I think Canada has an excellent opportunity of addressing this more so than any other country in the Western Hemisphere. But we've got to get people on track to begin to recognize it and then work to try to build an inclusive society.
Thanks, Dr. Hayden. So you were born in the US. Has your experience in general and in academia, has it differed by location at all? If so, how?
Well, I mean, it's different in a lot of ways, but in terms of race, let me first say that I first came to Canada in 1975. And a lot of times when I talk to people say, you're an American. Well, my Canadian passport looked just like anybody else's Canadian passport. So I'm as much Canadian as anybody else out there. And it's for many people, I went back and forth since 1975, but I've been in Canada longer than many people have lived in Canada. So as I then integrate my understanding of both countries, I don't think there's much difference when it comes to race. I mean, a lot of other difference we can talk about, but racism in Canada and racism in the US, from my perspective, is pretty much the same. The difference for me is that the numbers, the volumes, US is 10 times the size of Canada. So you would expect more coverage, more incidents than you would in Canada. But that doesn't mean that that single incident is different in the two countries. From a Black person, from a Black perspective, it feels the same whether I'm in Canada or in the US. I won't make that distinction, other than the fact the volume is the difference. There are more people in the US, and therefore there'll be more incidents.
Thank you, Dr. Hayden. What I'm going to do is that some of the questions that are coming have already been addressed. So I'm just gonna, go through and see if there are any unique questions here. Well, there's one from Sarah, and Sarah says, should we be acknowledging slavery in our history like how we now acknowledge land?
Yes, in fact, usually whenever I speak someplace, I have my own acknowledgement in which I acknowledge both the role of racism and colonialism. So, I mean, that's part of my package that when I normally present is to say not one or the other. And this is one thing I hear many times I talk. Canadians want to say, but we're focused on indigenous. What I come back to is that why you got to choose? Focus on both. I mean, it's not. I mean, or I get another question about is that people say you didn't say anything about indigenous people. Well, when indigenous people talk, no one go up to them and say you didn't say anything about Black people or you didn't say anything about other people. So, I mean, I think we got to, in Canada, we really do have to recognize that we have oppressed a lot of different populations, and to try to pit us against each other shouldn't be the work. Should not be there.
Thank you so much for an informative presentation. I agree with the need to challenge the past for a just future and also a just today. Can you provide some examples that you're aware of that facilitate policies, actions, systems that create socially just spaces for Black people?
Wow, I mean, that's a whole nother. I would love to spend time addressing that, but that's too big to try to do in this conversation. And I would just say there are efforts. There are Black people, white people, indigenous people, people across all the different spectrums of oppression that are working out there in very good and solid programs. I mean, we've had, some programs that have been more for show, but now I think we're really challenging each other now to say, no, let's try to make a difference and not just, punch a number or say we've done something. But so that's too big of a question for me to try to address. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, that's a hard one. I mean, I think that a lot of institutions are hopefully a lot of institutions are looking for ways to really put this in practice, and I think it's a struggle for a lot of institutions. And yeah, it might be interesting if there were like clear answers,
Yeah.
but my feeling is that it might just be contextual, that there aren't really a specific answer that responds to all the needs of different institutions.
Yeah, there's no silver bullet, and that's one thing I think a lot of the European thinking is there's got to be silver bullets, a long ranger out there. But to me, it's going to take a lot of different, unique, sometimes similar ways of trying to address this. There's been no one way to do it, and as you said, the context in which you're operating in is a big part of it. So, and if I had the silver bullet, it probably wouldn't be worth anything because it still has to be implemented by people in their location and their own environment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, this is a very interesting question, Dr. Hayden, and I'm curious about your answer on this one. Have you noticed any patterns where Canadian regions that had slavery in earlier areas had more clan activity or other manifestations of active anti-Black racism? Yeah, any key differences between the Maritimes, Quebec and Western Canada, etc.?
Well, again, first off, when we talk with slavery, we have to say that ended in 1834. So, I mean, the record of activities in support of anti-racism, addressing anti-racism was non-existent before the ending of slavery. There were abolitionists, there were lots of groups trying to end slavery, but during that time period, they weren't. Yeah, it wasn't a climate then. In fact, many of the abolitionists, both in Canada, U.S., and Great Britain, were opposed to slavery, but they were not in support of Black equality, and that's a fine difference. You got to understand that even when people who were supported what seemed to be Black people historically during slavery, they were not talking as Blacks as human beings, as full human beings. They were against slavery. And then when you go, so once slavery ended, in particular after the war between the states and the U.S., then a lot of the racism that was in Canada, because of the things they saw was happening there, the Klan in 1920 to 1950 was very active and throughout Canada. I mean, every province had a Klan chapter during that time period. So, the institution of white resistance has always been there, and we've always had to challenge it. I mean, again, we have to talk about it. As I opened my comment, was in Canada we didn't have as many, not that we didn't have any, overt forms of racism. The issue for Canada has always been the covert, the microaggression, the denial of Black roles, the discrimination, the prejudice that we had on the individual and group level, as opposed to the sort of Klan activity. Even though there were some Klan activities early on in our history, but so when you talk about both slavery and after slavery, it's very different in the Canadian context. But I still come back to, as I said earlier, as a Black person, it felt the same. Historically and present, it feels the same. Racism is racism. There's no such thing as Canadian racism, Canadian Black racism, and U.S. Black racism. As a Black person, it feels the same.
Thank you, Dr. Hayden. There is another question. Given that Canadian white ethos, do you given the Canadian white ethos, what do you think about the hierarchy among minorities? For example, privileging Francophone minorities over other minority identities.
Yeah, I guess that's a tough one to think about. But now, I would first of all say, European society is based on hierarchies: the king, the court, and the like. When we, as a nation, formed in the early days of stealing the land from indigenous people, we just copied that same type of system. I mean, if you look back on history of outside of, say, race, but just Canadian history, you can see that the elites have always been in control of this country. And therefore, the elites will maintain hierarchies to keep the masses from overthrowing them. So, as a society, those hierarchies are just embedded. It's embedded in how we organize our economy, how we decide on who gets land. I mean, it's just there. And then so what happens then? So for populations who are not in that upper echelon, then we may get breadcrumbs from your group of people who really identify with whatever that hierarchy is. So that then creates divisions within the population. But see, those divisions work in two ways. It works, first of all, it works as an internal clamping down of population disrest, and it works as an external for other people who may want to try to be a coalition with those. So the hierarchy is just not, as I see it, just a one group on another, but it's those two factors in there to make sure that everything remains, as we said from the founding of Canada, that is order. Order is important under the hierarchy and maintaining it.
Thank you, Dr. Hayden. I have an interesting question, and I'm curious about this one as well. Are there ways or some advice you would suggest to make research Black?
To make
research, to make research Black. I think my connection is unstable.
And in terms of include, is the question to include more race or Black aspect in history research? I'm not sure about.
Yeah, the question says to make research Black, and my interpretation of it is, actually I'm not even sure. What I have in mind is, what I'm thinking is, the question might be suggesting how do you maybe make it research, how do you make research center Black methodologies, stories, and narratives?
Well, I'm not sure if I'm still getting it. If the question is how do we get Black research onto the table or the agenda of Canadian mainstream, I mean first of all, we've got to get. You have to go back, and it's what my talk is about. If we're not giving our students in our schools a full story, then you won't have Black or white people interested in Black research. And so we've got to get that content into the schools where we learn most about what our ethos is about. And therefore, as people move into undergraduate school, they will see issues around race, not as a side, not as one colleague told me was that, oh yeah, you would be looking at race, but as part of telling the whole picture. So if I understand the question, what I would respond to is that we've got to get a thread of consciousness around race from the very beginning of education through the end, so that we can have, so by the time someone get into a PhD, their research won't be looked at as that's just a race thing, but looked at as important to telling the Canadian story, or look at in terms of important of trying to address concerns and social concerns of ills in our society. It's just not, so I think it's, if I can think from that standpoint, it's a full, it's just, it has to be a thread that's carrying on, that will eventually wind up to people making a choice to be scholars, to be a scholar, and look at issues around race.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hayden. We'll just have 2 more questions and we'll wrap up the event. Where is, I'm looking for this question here. When writing your work, do you find yourself being strategic with your wording in the hopes more of your work gets published because you already know they want to present a false image of Canadian history?
Well, that's why I've been limitedly published, because I haven't been willing to do that, and I have been penalized for being, as one reviewer said, provocative. so you know, I suffer from that. I mean, I can't, you know, I don't tone it down. I try. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to race full ahead and slam something, but I try to tell what I see in my analysis based on what is there, and you know, and it has been the reality and why I haven't gotten some things published, because I wouldn't tone it down.
Thanks, Dr. Hayden. The last one. Do you often collaborate with other Black scholars who conduct similar research in your work?
I mean, I haven't done it. I tend to write pretty much in isolation, except for my son, who's a MA student at York now. We're writing together, but my scholar work there's been a few things I've collaborated work with, but I tend to work alone. I'm in conversation with, I'm in meetings, I share resources. I'm connected with Black scholars, particularly Black Canadian scholars, but in terms of my work, I tend to work in isolation, or with my son.
Well, thanks, Dr. Hayden. I am going to reach out to you.
All right, well, welcome.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Cool. Thank you so much for being generous and kind with your with our questions, and I'm wondering if Dr. Daly or Nancy, you have any final comments to make?
Thank you, Moyo. Thank you, Dr. Hayden, for such a rich presentation. I have a million questions running through my head, and sort of at front is I'd love to hear more about firefighters being a white supremacist organization as a paramilitary organization. I think it's like a super intriguing question, and it makes me wonder also where else are you looking? You know, where are you moving forward? It seems as though you've sort of looked under several rocks and, you know, did some deep excavation to find the data that you presented. And so I'm really curious about where you're looking next and your next steps. You probably don't have time to answer that, but do you have any?
I can say, you know, that right now I have about 6 gigabytes of documents, photos, historical records of Black people that I'm trying to get up on my website. But the issues of the day around race, I'm spending a lot more time focused as they come up, and so that's I mean, at some point I hope to get to it. That's what my retirement should have been about, doing that. So you know, when it comes to the race in Canada, I really am. If something rings a bell, then I'm looking at it. In terms of my research, you know, I plan to be in New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island and Manitoba this summer before COVID hit, because those are 3 problems I haven't had the opportunity to go dig up. So when I show up in those sites, it's usually 10 to 2 weeks, and I very seldom see anybody. I'm just working from the time archives and libraries work and just collecting stuff with the hope that someday it's going to cut across all areas within historical perspective, and I will get that out either through publications or on my website. So I have not really, when it comes to race, I haven't limited in any areas, especially historically. I just go to a place and I just search and just collect. And wonderful thing now is that in the old days I had to get a copier, but now archives, libraries, and everything allow you to use your own camera. So that's great now. You can just, you know, so that's why I have so many documents now. It's all stuff there. I just got to organize it to get it out there.
Well, again, thank you for sharing such rich history of Canada and a vibrant history of Canada that we don't get access to. And it's such an important contribution to education generally, but such an important contribution to social work education as we build our capacity to be anti-racist, anti-Black, address anti-Black racism in our practices. So I think there are a lot of people tuned in who really are looking forward to your ongoing work. So thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
So I'm just going to bring this on out, and I want to thank you, Dr. Hayden, for joining us today. That was really fantastic. Thank you for your research and bringing this truth forward, this information forward that we would normally, it's nothing that we've ever learned in school ourselves, especially in Canada. I think a lot of people had commented that, and that was talked about in the Q&A a little bit. I would like to thank RENISON University College for this partnership, and Drs. Mutumba for hosting, and Dr. Daly for making this happen, to bringing this to everybody and having this being available for all of us to all view. Also, I would like to invite you, Dr. Hayden, to send me any resources that you would like to share with the attendees, and I will make sure that that gets to everyone along with the with your blog. I'll have that sent forward to everyone as well as soon as that's available. And thank you again. Everybody have a good weekend, and everyone take care.